Fawn Cox worked until 11 at night on July 26, 1989. The 16-year-old had just finished her shift at Worlds of Fun amusement park in Kansas City, Missouri. She drove home tired, knowing she had to be back at work the next day. She went straight to bed in her second-floor bedroom at the family home near 9th and Van Brunt Boulevard. While she slept, someone climbed up to her window. By morning, she would be dead, and her family would begin a 31-year search for answers. Fawn Nicole Cox was born on March 24, 1973 in Kansas City. She lived with her parents and younger sisters in a two-story house in a neighborhood that could be rough at times. The area near 9th and Van Brunt sat in the northeast section of the city, a community where families knew their neighbors and looked out for each other despite the challenges that came with poverty and limited resources. From an early age, Fawn helped her parents care for her younger sisters. Every Sunday, the family attended church together. When Fawn had free time for herself, she enjoyed swimming. She was a responsible older sister, someone her siblings could count on. As soon as she turned 16, she got a part-time job at Worlds of Fun. The amusement park offered summer employment to teenagers across the Kansas City metro area. Fawn wanted to help support her household and earn her own money. The Cox family lived in poverty. Money was tight. Fawn understood the financial pressure her parents faced and wanted to contribute what she could. Working at Worlds of Fun gave her that opportunity. She balanced school with her job, managing the schedule that many teenagers find difficult. Her family depended on each other to get by. July 26, 1989 was a Wednesday. Fawn worked her evening shift at Worlds of Fun. The amusement park stayed open late during summer months. She finished at 11 in the evening and drove home. She was tired from the long shift. She knew she had another shift scheduled for the next day. She needed rest. When Fawn arrived home, she went directly to her bedroom on the second floor. She did not socialize or stay up. She changed into her night clothes and went to bed. The house was quiet. Her family was already asleep. Air conditioning units ran throughout the house, creating white noise that helped people sleep during hot Missouri summer nights. Fawn's bedroom had a window that faced the back of the property. A trailer sat parked in a yard below. The positioning of that trailer would later prove significant. Someone familiar with the layout of the house and the yard would know that the trailer could be used to reach the second-floor windows. While the Cox family slept, someone approached the house from the back. The person climbed onto the trailer. From there, they could reach Fawn's window. They broke through and entered her bedroom. What happened next would devastate a family and haunt a community for more than 3 decades. Subscribe now to follow this investigation. Fawn's mother woke early on the morning of July 27, 1989. She prepared to start her day and went to wake her daughter for work. Fawn had another shift scheduled at Worlds of Fun. Her mother walked up the stairs to the second floor and approached Fawn's bedroom door. What she found would haunt her forever. Fawn lay in her bed, motionless. Her mother immediately knew something was terribly wrong. She screamed for help. The sound brought other family members running. They rushed into the bedroom and saw Fawn lying there, unresponsive. Someone called 911 immediately. Emergency responders arrived at the house near 9th and Van Brunt Boulevard within minutes. Paramedics entered the bedroom and confirmed what the family already feared. Fawn Cox was dead. She was 16 years old. The paramedics could see signs of violence. They notified the Kansas City Police Department that they had a homicide. Detectives and crime scene investigators descended on the Cox home. They secured the scene and began documenting everything. The bedroom showed clear evidence of a violent struggle. Fawn's body bore injuries consistent with strangulation. Investigators found evidence that she had been physically assaulted before her death. The window in Fawn's bedroom had been forced open from the outside. Someone had climbed up from the yard below. Investigators examined the trailer parked behind the house. It sat directly beneath Fawn's window, positioned in a way that made reaching the second floor possible. Someone had used it as a ladder. The assailant had entered through the window while Fawn slept. They attacked her in her own bed, in her own home, while her family slept just feet away in other rooms. The air conditioning units running throughout the house had masked any sounds of the struggle. Nobody heard Fawn fight for her life. Investigators collected evidence from the bedroom. They documented the scene with photographs. They gathered bedding and clothing for laboratory analysis. Most importantly, they collected biological evidence left behind by the attacker. The sexual assault had left bodily fluids at the scene. In 1989, DNA testing was still relatively new technology, but investigators knew this evidence could be crucial. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy on Fawn's body. The cause of death was strangulation. She had been manually strangled, meaning someone had used their hands to choke the life out of her. The examination confirmed assault had occurred. The violence inflicted on her suggested rage or a deeply disturbed individual. The Cox family was devastated. Their daughter and sister had been murdered in her own bedroom while they slept nearby. The guilt that comes with such proximity to violence began to consume them. How had they not heard anything? How had someone entered their home and taken their daughter without them knowing? Neighbors in the area around 9th and Van Brunt were shocked and terrified. If someone could break into a home and murder a teenage girl while her family slept, nobody was safe. Parents checked their windows and doors multiple times each night. The sense of security that had existed in the community evaporated overnight. Detectives began canvassing the neighborhood. They knocked on doors and asked if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night of July 26th or the early morning hours of July 27th. Most people had nothing to report. The air conditioning units that ran in nearly every home had created the same white noise that prevented the Cox family from hearing the attack. Investigators looked at the layout of the property and the positioning of the trailer. Whoever committed the murder knew the house. They knew which window belonged to Fawn's bedroom. They knew about the trailer and how it could be used to reach the second floor. The attack suggested familiarity with the location. Kansas City Police Department homicide detectives took control of the investigation into Fawn Cox's murder. They knew they were looking for someone who had targeted a 16-year-old girl in her own bedroom. The brutality of the attack and the location suggested someone with local knowledge. Detectives interviewed every member of the Cox family. They needed to understand the household dynamics and learn who had access to the property. Family members described Fawn as a good kid who worked hard and helped out at home. She had no known enemies. She did not have a boyfriend or any romantic entanglements that might have led to violence. She went to school, went to work, and spent time with her family. Investigators asked about the trailer parked beneath Fawn's window. The family explained it had been there for some time. Anyone who visited the house or spent time in the neighborhood would have seen it. The positioning was not a secret. However, knowing about the trailer and knowing which bedroom belonged to Fawn required more specific knowledge. The evidence collected from the bedroom went to the crime laboratory for analysis. Detectives hoped the biological material left by the attacker would provide answers. In 1989, DNA technology existed but was not yet the standard tool it would become. Testing took time and required significant quantities of material. Investigators had collected enough evidence to proceed with analysis, but results would not come quickly. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood around 9th and Van Brunt Boulevard multiple times. They spoke with residents, business owners, and anyone who might have been in the area during the night of July 26th. Several people mentioned seeing teenagers hanging around the neighborhood that evening. 3 names came up repeatedly in these conversations. The 3 teenagers were known to police. They had minor criminal histories and reputations for causing trouble in the area. Witnesses placed them near the Cox home on the night Fawn was murdered. Detectives brought them in for questioning. Each teenager denied any involvement in the murder. They admitted being in the neighborhood, but insisted they had nothing to do with what happened to Fawn. Without physical evidence linking the teenagers to the scene, detectives could not make arrests based solely on witness statements placing them in the general area. They needed more. The investigation continued with the 3 teenagers as persons of interest. Crime scene investigators had photographed and documented everything inside Fawn's bedroom. They looked for fingerprints on the window frame and sill. They searched for any trace evidence the attacker might have left behind. The forced entry through the window had left marks that showed how someone had pried it open from outside. The medical examiner's report provided detailed information about the injuries Fawn sustained. The strangulation had been manual, meaning bare hands around her neck. The strength required suggested an adult male, though investigators could not rule out other possibilities based on physical evidence alone. The sexual assault evidence remained the most promising lead. Detectives constructed a timeline of Fawn's final hours. She finished work at Worlds of Fun at 11 in the evening. She drove straight home and went to bed. Her family confirmed she arrived home and went directly to her room. The attack occurred sometime between midnight and 6 in the morning when her mother found her. The neighborhood around 9th and Van Brunt had a history of crime, but murders were not common. Most incidents involved property crimes, drug offenses, or minor assaults. The brutal killing of a teenage girl in her own bed represented an escalation that frightened everyone in the community. Kansas City police held a press conference to appeal for information from the public. They released basic details about the murder and asked anyone with knowledge to come forward. They emphasized that Fawn had been killed in her home while her family slept nearby. The department wanted to reassure the community that every available resource was being dedicated to solving the case. Tips began coming in to the police department. Some callers repeated the information about the 3 teenagers seen in the neighborhood. Others provided names of people they considered suspicious or dangerous. Detectives followed up on each lead, but nothing produced a breakthrough. The biological evidence collected from the scene underwent preliminary testing. Laboratory technicians confirmed the presence of semen and other bodily fluids. The samples were preserved for further analysis. In 1989, creating a DNA profile from such evidence required time and specialized expertise. The technology existed but had not yet become routine in criminal investigations. Detectives continued pressuring the 3 teenagers who had been near the Cox home on the night of the murder. They brought them in for additional questioning. The investigators believed at least one of them knew something about what happened to Fawn. The teenagers maintained their innocence, but their stories contained inconsistencies that raised suspicions. The pressure on Kansas City Police Department to solve Fawn Cox's murder intensified as weeks passed without an arrest. Detectives focused their attention on the 3 teenagers who had been seen near the Cox home on the night of July 26, 1989. The continued questioning eventually produced a witness who claimed to have seen something significant. A person came forward and told police they had witnessed one or more of the teenagers near the Cox house around the time of the murder. The witness provided details that seemed to corroborate investigators' suspicions. Based on this testimony, prosecutors filed charges against all 3 teenagers. The Jackson County Prosecutor's Office believed they had enough evidence to proceed with murder charges. The 3 young men were arrested and charged with the sexual assault and murder of Fawn Cox. News of the arrests spread quickly through the neighborhood around 9th and Van Brunt Boulevard. Many residents felt relieved that police had caught the people responsible for such a horrific crime. The Cox family hoped they would finally see justice for their daughter. The teenagers maintained their innocence. They insisted they had nothing to do with Fawn's death. Their families hired attorneys to defend them. The defense lawyers began examining the evidence the prosecution planned to present at trial. What they found raised serious concerns about the strength of the case. The physical evidence collected from Fawn's bedroom did not link any of the 3 teenagers to the scene. The biological material left by the attacker had been preserved and tested, but the results did not match any of the accused. Fingerprints found at the scene did not belong to them. There was no forensic evidence connecting them to the murder. The entire prosecution case rested on the testimony of a single witness who claimed to have seen the teenagers near the Cox home. Defense attorneys pressed the witness during pre-trial proceedings. Under scrutiny, the witness's story began to fall apart. Details changed. The timeline became murky. The certainty that had initially seemed so strong began to crumble. As the trial date approached, the witness recanted the testimony. The person admitted they had not actually seen what they claimed to have seen. The reasons for the false accusation remained unclear, but the impact was devastating to the prosecution. Without the witness testimony and with no physical evidence linking the teenagers to the crime, The case collapsed. The Jackson County Prosecutor's Office had no choice but to drop all charges against the three young men. They were released from custody. The teenagers had spent months in jail for a murder they did not commit. Their reputations were destroyed. Their families had spent money on legal fees. The community that had been so quick to believe in their guilt now watched them walk free. The Cox family was devastated by the development. They had believed the police had caught the person who murdered their daughter. Now they learned the investigation was back to square one. Nobody had been held accountable for what happened to Fawn Cox. The real killer remained free. Kansas City Police Department faced criticism for rushing to make arrests without sufficient evidence. The reliance on a single witness whose testimony proved unreliable damaged the department's credibility. Detectives had been so focused on the three teenagers that other leads may have been neglected or overlooked. The investigation had to start over. Detectives reviewed everything from the beginning. They looked at all the evidence collected from Fawn's bedroom. The biological samples remained the most promising avenue for identifying the killer. The DNA profile existed, but in the early 1990s, law enforcement databases were still being developed. The National DNA Database, known as CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, was not yet fully operational. Investigators entered the DNA profile from the Fawn Cox murder into every available system. They hoped for a match with a known offender or with evidence from another crime. No matches came back. The killer's DNA was in the system, waiting, but there was no one to compare it against. The Cox family had to live with the knowledge that Fawn's murderer walked free somewhere in Kansas City or beyond. The person who climbed through their daughter's window and strangled her in her own bed had escaped justice. The false accusations and failed prosecution made the pain even worse. They had experienced hope only to have it ripped away. Years began to pass. The investigation went cold. Detectives moved on to other cases. The file remained open, but without new leads or developments, there was little progress to be made. The DNA evidence sat preserved in storage, a silent witness to a crime that remained unsolved. The neighborhood around 9th and Van Brunt Boulevard tried to move forward. Parents remained vigilant about their children's safety. The memory of what happened to Fawn Cox served as a constant reminder that danger could strike anywhere, even in the supposed safety of one's own home. The three teenagers who had been wrongly accused struggled to rebuild their lives. Being charged with such a heinous crime left permanent scars. Some people in the community continued to view them with suspicion despite the charges being dropped. The damage done by the false accusations would last for years. The 1990s passed without any breakthroughs in the Fawn Cox murder investigation. The DNA profile from the crime scene remained in storage at the Kansas City Police Department Crime Laboratory. Detectives checked it periodically against new entries in criminal databases, but no matches appeared. The killer's identity stayed hidden. The Cox family struggled to find closure. They held memorials for Fawn on the anniversary of her death each year. They refused to let her memory fade. The pain of losing their daughter and sister never diminished. Every birthday that passed, every holiday without her, reminded them that someone had taken her away and faced no consequences. Technology and forensic science advanced throughout the 2000s. DNA testing became more sophisticated and more widely used. The CODIS database grew as more states required convicted offenders to submit DNA samples. Law enforcement agencies across the country began solving cold cases by comparing old evidence against newly entered profiles. Kansas City police hoped Fawn's case would be among those solved through these technological advances. Detectives uploaded Fawn's crime scene DNA profile into CODIS as the system expanded. They waited for the notification that would indicate a match. Years passed. No notification came. The killer either had no criminal record requiring DNA submission or had never been arrested for any offense that would put their profile into the database. The neighborhood around 9th and Van Brunt Boulevard changed over the decades. Families moved in and out. Young people who had been children when Fawn was murdered grew up and moved away. New residents had no knowledge of what happened in 1989. The house where the Cox family lived changed ownership. For many in the community, Fawn's murder became a forgotten tragedy, but some people refused to forget. a Kansas City man named Monty Clark took an interest in Fawn's unsolved murder. He had no personal connection to the family, but felt compelled to keep attention on the case. Monty began researching everything he could find about the investigation. He collected news articles, police reports, and any public information available. Monty Clark spent more than 20 years advocating for Fawn Cox. He believed someone in Kansas City knew who killed her. He organized community events to raise awareness about the unsolved murder. He worked with other activists who fought to keep cold cases in the public eye. Monty's dedication kept Fawn's name alive when it might otherwise have been forgotten entirely. The Kansas City Police Department Cold Case Unit periodically reviewed the Fawn Cox file. Detective supervisors assigned investigators to take fresh looks at the evidence. Each review ended the same way. The DNA profile remained the strongest lead, but without a match in any database, there was no way forward. The investigation had reached a dead end that seemed impossible to overcome. The 2010s brought new developments in DNA technology that offered hope for solving old cases. Genetic genealogy emerged as a revolutionary tool for law enforcement. The technique used DNA from crime scenes and compared it against publicly available genetic databases built by ancestry companies. Investigators could identify relatives of unknown suspects and work backward through family trees to find the actual perpetrator. The Golden State Killer case in California demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy. In 2018, investigators used the technique to identify Joseph James DeAngelo as the serial killer and rapist who had terrorized communities for decades. The breakthrough inspired law enforcement agencies nationwide to revisit their own cold cases with DNA evidence. Kansas City Police Department recognized that genetic genealogy could be the tool needed to finally identify Fawn Cox's killer. However, the process required specialized expertise and significant financial resources. The department needed funding to hire genetic genealogists and pay for the extensive testing and research involved. Budget constraints made it difficult to allocate resources to a case that was decades old. In the summer of 2020, an opportunity arose that would change everything for the Cox family. The federal government launched Operation Legend, named after 4-year-old Legend Taliaferro, who had been shot and killed in Kansas City. The operation provided federal funding to help local law enforcement solve violent crimes. Part of that funding was specifically designated for advanced forensic testing, including genetic genealogy work on cold cases. Kansas City Police Department Cold Case Supervisor Captain Ben Caldwell saw the opportunity. He submitted the Fawn Cox case for inclusion in the Operation Legend funding. The application was approved. For the first time in 31 years, the investigation had the resources needed to use cutting-edge technology on the DNA evidence that had been waiting in storage since 1989. The biological material collected from Fawn's bedroom was sent to a specialized laboratory capable of extracting and analyzing degraded DNA. The samples had been properly preserved, but 3 decades of storage presented challenges. Laboratory technicians worked carefully to develop a complete genetic profile suitable for genealogical comparison. The laboratory successfully extracted a complete DNA profile from the biological evidence collected in 1989. The profile was uploaded to publicly available genetic genealogy databases where millions of people had submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry and find relatives. The search began for matches that could lead investigators to Fawn Cox's killer. Genetic genealogists working on the case found several distant relatives of the unknown suspect. These matches represented people who shared common ancestors with the killer somewhere in their family trees. The genealogists began the painstaking work of building out family trees, going back generations to find the point where these different branches connected. The process required accessing historical records, including birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, and obituaries. Genealogists traced lineages forward through time, identifying all descendants of common ancestors. They eliminated branches that could not have produced a male suspect who would have been in Kansas City in 1989. As the family trees took shape, certain branches became more promising than others. The genealogists looked for males who would have been the right age and in the right location when Fawn was murdered. They cross-referenced names against public records to determine who had lived in Kansas City during that time. One name emerged from the research that caught investigators' attention: Donald Cox Jr. had been living in Kansas City in 1989. More significantly, he was related to Fawn's family. Donald was Fawn's cousin, 5 years older than her. He would have known the layout of the Cox house and the positioning of the trailer beneath Fawn's bedroom window. Detectives immediately recognized the significance of a family connection. Donald Cox Jr. would have had access to information about Fawn's bedroom and the property. He likely knew her work schedule. He would have known when she would be home and asleep. The familiarity required to carry out the attack suddenly made complete sense. Investigators needed to confirm the genetic genealogy findings with direct DNA comparison. They searched for any samples that might exist from Donald Cox Jr. What they discovered was both fortunate and tragic. Donald had died in 2006 at the age of 42. However, the medical examiner's office still had a blood sample taken during his autopsy. The blood sample was sent to the laboratory for DNA testing. Technicians extracted a profile and compared it to the DNA from Fawn's murder scene. The results came back as a definitive match. Donald Cox Jr. was the person who had climbed through Fawn's window, sexually assaulted her, and strangled her to death on July 27, 1989. Detectives reviewed everything they knew about Donald Cox Jr. He had been 23 years old when he murdered his 16-year-old cousin. He lived in the Kansas City area and would have had opportunities to visit the Cox family home. He knew Fawn and her family trusted him as a relative. Investigators checked Donald's criminal history. He had no major convictions that would have required DNA submission to CODIS. His profile had never been in any law enforcement database. Without genetic genealogy, his identity as Fawn's killer would likely never have been discovered. He had gone through his entire life without facing consequences for what he did. The news that Donald Cox Jr. was already dead meant there would be no arrest, no trial, and no prison sentence. Justice in the traditional sense was impossible. However, the identification finally gave the Cox family answers they had sought for more than 3 decades. They would know who killed Fawn and why the crime had seemed so personal and targeted. Captain Ben Caldwell and other investigators prepared to notify the Cox family. They knew the revelation that Fawn's killer was her own cousin would be devastating in a different way than if he had been a stranger. The betrayal of family trust added another layer of pain to an already unbearable tragedy. The genetic genealogy work that identified Donald Cox Jr. represented the same methodology used to catch the Golden State Killer. The technique had proven itself capable of solving cases that seemed impossible through traditional investigation. Fawn's case demonstrated that even evidence collected before modern DNA technology existed could still yield answers decades later if properly preserved. Kansas City Police Department prepared a press release announcing the identification of Fawn Cox's killer. After 31 years, the investigation that had gone cold could finally be closed. The community that had wondered about the unsolved murder would learn the truth. Donald Cox Jr. was born in 1966, making him 7 years old when Fawn was born in 1973. The two grew up as cousins in Kansas City. Family gatherings would have brought them together throughout their childhoods. Donald would have visited the Cox home on 9th and Van Brunt Boulevard many times over the years. By the time Fawn turned 16 and started working at Worlds of Fun, Donald was 23 years old. He had grown into adulthood while Fawn was still a teenager navigating high school and her first job. The age difference and their family connection meant Fawn would have trusted him completely. She would never have suspected her older cousin posed any danger to her. Investigators pieced together what likely happened on the night of July 26, 1989. Donald knew Fawn worked evening shifts at the amusement park. He knew she would come home tired and go straight to bed. He knew the layout of the house and which bedroom belonged to her. He knew about the trailer parked beneath her window that could be used to reach the second floor. The attack was not random or opportunistic. Donald planned what he would do. He waited until the family was asleep and the house was quiet. He approached from the back of the property where he would not be seen from the street. He climbed onto the trailer and forced open Fawn's window. He entered her bedroom while she slept. What drove Donald to commit such a horrific act against his own cousin remained a mystery that would never be fully answered. He took that knowledge to his grave in 2006. Investigators could only speculate about his motivations based on the evidence and the nature of the crime. The assault component suggested Donald had developed inappropriate feelings towards Fawn. Whether those feelings were recent or had existed for some time was impossible to determine. The violence of the strangulation indicated rage or a need to silence her. Perhaps Fawn woke during the assault and recognized her attacker. Donald may have panicked, realizing his cousin could identify him. After murdering Fawn, Donald climbed back out the window and left the property. He returned to his own life as if nothing had happened. When news spread through the family that Fawn had been killed, Donald participated in the collective grief. He attended her funeral. He consoled family members. He maintained the facade of an innocent relative mourning a tragic loss. Donald watched as police arrested and charged the 3 teenagers from the neighborhood. He said nothing while innocent young men sat in jail for a crime he committed. When the charges were dropped and the investigation went cold, Donald must have believed he had escaped detection. The DNA evidence existed, but the technology to use it effectively did not yet exist in a way that threatened him. For 17 years after killing Fawn, Donald Cox Jr. lived as a free man. He went about his daily life knowing what he had done. Whether he felt guilt or remorse was known only to him. He never confessed. He never tried to make amends. He carried the secret until his death in 2006 at age 42. The circumstances of Donald's death were not publicly detailed by investigators. What mattered was that the medical examiner had preserved a blood sample during the autopsy. That sample, stored for 14 years after his death, became the key to finally confirming his guilt. Detectives examined whether Donald had committed any other crimes during his lifetime. They searched for unsolved sexual assaults or murders that might have similar characteristics. The review of his background revealed no other known violent offenses. Whether Fawn was his only victim or if there were others who were never connected to him remained an open question. The fact that Donald was family explained why the attack had seemed so targeted and personal. It explained how the killer knew exactly which window to climb through and when Fawn would be home and vulnerable. It explained why there had been no signs of someone unfamiliar with the property attempting a break-in. For the Cox family, learning that Donald was responsible added a dimension of betrayal to their grief. Fawn had been murdered by someone she knew and trusted, someone who sat at the same holiday tables and attended the same family events. Someone who should have protected her instead of destroying her. The revelation that a family member committed the murder also meant the Cox family had unknowingly spent time with Fawn's killer after her death. They had interacted with Donald at gatherings and functions, never knowing what he had done. The violation of that family trust cut deeper than if the killer had been a stranger. Investigators recognized that solving the case through genetic genealogy meant Donald's extended family would also learn disturbing information about their relative. The technology that brought answers to Fawn's family simultaneously shattered another branch of the same family tree. On November 10, 2020, Kansas City Police Department contacted the Cox family to schedule a meeting. Detectives told them there had been a significant development in Fawn's case. After 31 years of waiting, the family prepared themselves for news they had almost stopped believing would ever come. Captain Ben Caldwell and other investigators sat down with Fawn's parents and explained what the genetic genealogy investigation had revealed. They told the family that Fawn's killer had been identified through DNA comparison. Then they delivered the shocking truth that the murderer was Donald Cox Jr., Fawn's own cousin. The news devastated the family in ways they had not anticipated. Learning the killer's identity brought some measure of relief, but discovering it was Donald added profound pain. Fawn's parents had sometimes wondered about their nephew over the years. They had questioned whether Donald might have been involved, but dismissed the thoughts as too horrible to seriously consider. Now they learned their instincts had been correct. The family's grief was compounded by the knowledge that Donald had died 14 years earlier. There would be no arrest to witness, no trial where they could face him and demand answers, no prison sentence to provide a sense that justice had been served. Donald had lived more than half his life after murdering Fawn and died without ever being held accountable. Fawn's parents told investigators they experienced mixed emotions. They were relieved to finally know the truth after 3 decades of uncertainty. They were grateful to the detectives who never gave up on finding answers. But they were also sad and angry that Donald had escaped earthly justice. The only consolation was knowing he could no longer hurt anyone else. The Cox family had spent 31 years imagining who might have killed their daughter and sister. They had considered numerous scenarios and suspects. The reality that the killer was family shocked them deeply. They thought about all the times they had seen Donald after Fawn's death. They remembered conversations and interactions that now took on sinister new meanings. Kansas City Police Department held a press conference on November 10, 2020, to announce the resolution of the Fawn Cox cold case. Captain Caldwell addressed the media and explained how genetic genealogy funded through Operation Legend had led to the identification of Donald Cox Jr. as the killer. He praised the laboratory technicians and genealogists whose work made the breakthrough possible. The press conference highlighted the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate solutions seem impossible. The biological samples collected in 1989 had been carefully stored for over 3 decades. That preservation allowed modern technology to finally extract answers that earlier methods could not provide. Captain Caldwell also acknowledged the role of community advocate Monty Clark, who had spent more than 20 years keeping Fawn's case in the public eye. Monty's dedication ensured that Fawn's murder was not forgotten by investigators or the community. His efforts helped maintain pressure to find answers for the family. The announcement of the case's resolution brought closure to a community that had wondered about the unsolved murder for decades. Residents who remembered the fear that gripped the neighborhood in 1989 finally learned the truth. The fact that the killer had been a family member rather than a random predator provided some reassurance that the threat had been specific rather than widespread. The use of genetic genealogy in the Fawn Cox case demonstrated the power of the technology to solve crimes that seem unsolvable through traditional methods. The technique had already proven successful in identifying the Golden State Killer and numerous other cold case suspects. Fawn's case added to the growing list of families who received answers through this innovative approach. Law enforcement agencies across the country took note of the success in Kansas City. The case illustrated the value of federal funding programs like Operation Legend that provided resources for advanced forensic testing. Many police departments lacked the budget to pursue genetic genealogy investigations without external financial support. The Fawn Cox case also raised awareness about the importance of DNA databases and genetic genealogy databases in solving crimes. The willingness of millions of people to submit their DNA to ancestry companies created the comparison tools that made identifying unknown suspects possible. Without those databases, Donald Cox Jr.'s identity might never have been discovered. For the Cox family, the resolution brought an end to decades of uncertainty, but not an end to their grief. Fawn would always be the 16-year-old girl who never got to experience adulthood. She never graduated from high school, never went to college, never fell in love, never had children of her own. Donald Cox Jr. took all of those possibilities away from her on July 27, 1989. The family continued to honor Fawn's memory. They were grateful that her name could now be associated with justice served, even if that justice came too late to prosecute the person responsible. They hoped her case would inspire other families waiting for answers in unsolved murders to maintain hope that advancing technology might one day provide the breakthrough they needed. Fawn Nicole Cox was laid to rest years earlier, but her case lived on as an example of how persistence, proper evidence preservation, and innovative technology can combine to solve even the coldest of cases. After 31 years, her family finally knew the truth about what happened to their beloved daughter and sister on that terrible night in 1989.